comrades. Thanks. But we also have a more kind of practical, let's say, interest in understanding better what's happening in Poland, and that is the commonality in terms of the rise of far-right politics, the surprising to some electoral gains, and what are the kind of common strategies and tactics that allow the right to win across Europe. Strategies and tactics that people like Nigel Farage are very much following and learning from, so we should be as well. And so tonight we will chat with two familiar faces, I think, friends of Another Europe. First of all, our own National Committee member, Anna Oppenheim, and also Eva, and please, sorry if I terribly butcher your surname, Eva Pospieszyńska from the Polkast podcast. And Anna and Eva are both also active in Razem that we mentioned, and have been for years organizing for migrant solidarity movements, both in Poland and here in the UK. A lot of these things I think will crop up in our conversation later on, but the way we've structured this evening is we're going to give Anna and then Eva some time to reflect on the elections. They will give us some context. They will paint a picture of like the demographics, the emerging alliances, and the sort of strategic lessons that we're seeing develop. And this will hopefully bring about quite a few questions and thoughts and responses from the audience. So we will have plenty of time for a Q&A. These member sessions tend to be quite brief, so we aim to wrap up by 7 p.m. And I'm quite keen to make that happen because I'm currently in Bulgaria, so I'm 2 hours ahead of everyone. And so on that note, and without more delays, I'm going to hand over to Anna to introduce the context of the elections and why we're discussing them now. What happened? Was it expected? Was it unexpected? And what kind of trends we're seeing with the win of the right in Poland?
Thank you for the introduction. I'm going to have to be camera off for this part because my laptop is overheating, so I can either have sound or my face be visible. But you'll remember what I look like. So yes, as Anna said, I'm going to give a bit of an overview of what happened in the election. So as you will be aware, on the 1st of June, the right-wing Trump ally Karol Nawrocki won very narrowly, 51-49 at the presidential election in Poland. Who is Karol Nawrocki? He's 42, making him one of the youngest heads of states in the world, although no one seems to mention it. He's someone who was previously a completely unknown figure in politics. His background is as a historian. He's worked in museums. He was head of the Institute for National Remembrance, very much seen as a Law and Justice government appointee. He was part of the conservative Law and Justice takeover of cultural and heritage institutions. His campaign was largely based on the same far-right talking points that we all know: attacking LGBT plus people, attacking migrants, criticizing the EU's climate policies, allying himself with the likes of Trump. There was also some anti-Ukrainian sentiment, although primarily targeted at the 1 million Ukrainian refugees who are currently in Poland, as opposed to talking about the conflict as such. He was not seen as the favorite to win. For ages, by far the favorite was Rafał Trzaskowski, the liberal candidate of Donald Tusk's party KO. And this election was seen by many people as an opportunity to finish the job. The job started in 2023. What do I mean by that? So just to give you a bit of a historical background, for 8 years, from 2015 to 2023, Law and Justice, a very conservative, hardline Catholic nationalist party was in power in Poland. It's remembered for its attack on abortion rights, on LGBT-free zones, which are being declared by law and justice-run authorities across the country. It's remembered for its conflicts with the EU over the rule of law and undermining the independence of the judiciary system, and for its cruel anti-migrant policies related to the Belarus border crisis, where a wall was built on the border, where there were illegal pushbacks, border guards violently attacking migrants, and people being left to die in the forest, with NGOs being banned from accessing it. And in the autumn of 2023, following an unprecedented mobilization, a record-breaking turnout of 75%, huge amount of enthusiasm, law and justice was defeated, and a more centrist coalition government took power, led by Donald Tusk, with two smaller coalition partners. So Trzecia Droga, another center-right party, and Lewica, the kind of social democratic center-left. What's the government done over the past 2 years? Not very much, to be honest. So at the very beginning, it did buy and sell some goodwill by announcing like very substantial public sector pay rises. But since then, there has been very little progress on the key demands that it was elected on, because of the opposition of some of the more conservative elements and MPs within the coalition. It's not managed to liberalize abortion law. It's not managed to introduce civil partnerships for same-sex couples. It's done really nothing more to improve the lives of the poorest in society, of working class people, or the state of our public services. So it's widely seen as a disappointment, and the dominant vibe has been stagnation. And I think that's part of the responsibility, for Trzaskowski's loss, is just how weak the government has been. And this campaign really was Trzaskowski's to lose. As I said, he was seen as a favorite, the kind of liberal candidate. He is and has been the mayor of Warsaw. He has a very sleek public image, claims to be fluent in 5 languages, has an academic background, is considered good looking and quite popular internationally as well. He was for a long time known as a liberal. He was in the progressive wing of KO, was outspoken on LGBT rights, was also seen as being very pro-EU, more sort of internationalist. But as the campaign went on, he was pitching right. So even before the campaign officially launched, he was advocating for Ukrainian refugees who don't have a job to be stripped of the right to access child benefits. He was taking hard lines against accepting refugees, as was the rest of his party, criticizing more and more the EU's climate policies, really trying to pitch himself as not that different from Nawrocki, but just a sleeker, less embarrassing version. Meanwhile, Nawrocki's campaign was disaster after disaster, scandal after scandal. So our current president, just weeks before the vote, was accused of having stolen an old man's home. He claimed to be living in the house of someone he was looking after, but it turned out that old man was actually in a care setting, and he was just occupying his home. He admitted publicly to having taken part in hooligan brawls and was actually quite proud of it. He was also alleged to have profited from procuring sex workers when he worked as a security guard in a hotel in his youth. For a conservative candidate, you'd think those kind of scandals would undermine his chances of winning. But the Liberal campaign was so bad that he still managed to sneak in. I think the first real upset of this election came after the first round. So the first round was on the 18th of May. As it was predicted, Trzaskowski won that, although quite narrowly. But Nawrocki came second, obviously as expected. But then the third and fourth placing candidates were representatives of the far right. And we're talking extreme far right. We're talking openly anti-Semitic, people who've in the past advocated against democracy, who ally themselves with people who say that women should not have the right to vote. We're talking extreme far right. There are some differences between the two candidates, maybe I will explain, but really quite radical. Together, they won 21% of the vote. which positions the far right firmly as a third force in Poland, even if you don't consider Law and Justice to be far right, which is a whole different debate. And then what happened afterwards? After that result, Sławomir Mencen, who was the third placing candidate, invited both the frontrunners for live stream debates. And both candidates used that to try to appeal to far-right voters. In the case of Nawrocki, that was not surprising. He was just nodding along to anything Mencen was saying, accepting all of his demands without an issue. In terms of Trzaskowski, there was some pushback. He did disagree on trans rights, for example. He did single disagreements on a number of issues, but it was all very polite. And then he also committed, for example, on the live stream to oppose any new taxes and to other policies the far right was demanding. And then the two guys had a little photo op with a beer being like, you know, we can disagree on things, but fundamentally we're all friends here. So really normalizing the far right and normalizing far right rhetoric. And, you know, as we all know now, that didn't work, that backfired. And I think throughout the campaign, really normalizing and agreeing and boosting far right talking points really went against Trzaskowski and against KO and actually helped the right. So where are we now? So the job of 2023 was not finished. After 10 years of a Law and Justice president, we now have another one. What powers does the president have? Luckily, they're quite limited. The main tool in his disposal is the right to veto bills. So if the current government tries to pass anything progressive, he'll be able to veto it. Even more worryingly, if at the next general election, if a more right-wing government is to come to power, there'll basically be no checks and balances to stop them from undermining Polish democracy, from passing all kinds of Trumpian laws they can come up with. So I think that's where the real danger comes. He's also the head of state, which means he'll be sent to all kinds of international summits and represent the country internationally. Even though he's officially meant to follow the foreign policy of the Polish government, we are likely to see Poland allying itself internationally more with the likes of Trump and Orban and other representatives of the far right. So I think that's really where the danger lies. And, you know, there is a lot that we can learn. You know, it's a bit too late. It is too late now to change the result of this election, but hopefully there's things we can learn going forward. I think Eva will talk a little bit about where that leaves the Polish left.
Thanks, Anna. That's been really useful to hear as a summary, and it sounds like a bit of a wild campaign with all of these kind of scandals, but in many ways it just shows you that this theater around elections actually plays more often than not plays into the hands of the far right. And we can maybe later talk a little bit about that kind of very interesting setup where the far right candidate, like the third guy, allows himself to be this kind of arbiter in a televised debate. I think that's a really interesting kind of moment from this election and what it might mean for the future. But I'm going to give the word back to Eva to tell us a little bit about where the left is at the moment, what kind of resistance is being organized, and where do you see like the biggest kind of challenges, but maybe also moments of opportunity for an alternative.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for organizing this call. Yes, I think I'll start with giving you a bit of an overview about left and what was the more progressive force doing during this election, because there is quite a lot of positive news here, although the wider context is obviously quite bleak. And then we can also, I think, draw some connections between this like Polish context and the UK, because there are actually quite interesting parallels and things that can help us to think about like what we can do as the left as well. So I must say that I am very pleased with the way Razem approached this campaign. And again, it's important to come back to the context that Anna mentioned. So what happened with the general election in 2023 when Razem decided not to join the coalition government of Donald Tusk. But we were still in kind of like a split kind of situation. So one leg outside of the coalition government, but one leg in. because we were still in a kind of electoral coalition with the wider left, led by Lewica party, which contains smaller parties, but really is very much associated, with the old kind of SLD government that used to be there during the transformation period, and lots of people who like Kazasty, who are just kind of like seen as those like old communists, so to speak, but obviously communism in a very like specific context of Poland. But these are people who basically are known for being careerists, and they often just jump on an opportunity to be in the government for whatever cost. And then, so Razem didn't join because we wanted to negotiate certain terms for joining the coalition. Those terms were not won. And instead of Lewica, so our coalition partners in this election, to kind of like to help us go above the threshold, instead of joining Razem and taking that leverage, they decided to sign the agreement. So Razem was sort of left on its own and in this weird position for over a year. And then we decided to actually totally separate both from the coalition government and the Lewica partnership. And this was the first election where we sort of went completely independent. And I must say that this already is proving to give like really good results. So our presidential candidate on the kind of progressive left side was Adrian Zandberg, but he was also running against another left wing candidate, Magda Biejat, who used to be a co-leader of Razem, but she left the party when we decided to split from the Lewica coalition, because she was sort of arguing that that's a mistake. She was arguing that Razem needs to take more agency within this government, and that the way to take that agency is actually to get involved with Tusk and the broader coalition parties, which we obviously thought at this point is not possible, because we've been trying to push for certain bills. We've been trying to be the progressive wing of the Lewica party in general, and we only faced kind of lack of interest and compliance with the majority within the coalition. So, what Anna mentioned with like Trzaskowski and the liberal candidate having difficulties to like campaign was the fact that although there were so many promises around like women's rights, around reforms like LGBT plus rights, but also just like getting rid of like, for instance, very trashy contracts for workers, none of this has happened. And there was not even like, there were no bills given to Andrzej Duda, so the Law and Justice's president, to block them. So the reality is the coalition government didn't even test Andrzej Duda and Law and Justice, and didn't have anything to show that they tried to push for those changes. And so our Razem's candidate, Adrian Zandberg, really leaned into that. So his whole narrative for this campaign was to pinpoint very openly how basically disappointing the government of Donald Tusk is, to show that he's not afraid to be like the kind of more like proper opposition, that not afraid to criticize both Law and Justice and the liberal force, but from the left-wing perspective. So something, if we were to try to do this, connection between the UK, something that the Greens are currently trying to do, where they're very much open to, criticizing Labour, but also simultaneously offering like a more radical alternative, but on the left-wing side, so like an alternative to reform, basically. And this is where things actually get interesting, because what we've seen is that there was a certain overlap between the narrative that Adrian Zandberg was pushing and the far-right candidate Sławomir Mencen that came third in this election, because both Adrian Zandberg and Sławomir Mencen leaned into this message of like the duopole, so-called, so the so-called alternative between Law and Justice and KO hasn't been working. We've been in this like horrible position for 20 years now, that choose between those two parties, but none of them actually offers real change. And so the only way to really go and do something and actually question the status quo is to vote outside of those two parties, to vote outside of Law and Justice and KO. But obviously for very different reasons when it comes to like who do you actually cast your vote, because Adrian Zandberg was very much coming at it from the perspective of someone who wants women's rights, who wants LGBT plus rights, but also, and I think that was quite visible, the Razem strategy was to focus on workers' rights and to not sound like we're just kind of talking this very like big cities kind of language, where you're not really resonating with people's like problems outside of the big cities, where you're like not really paying attention to just like bread and butter issues. And another thing that Razem was doing, I think, quite successfully was really trying to show that we are a party that also comes out of like organizing outside of the electoral politics. So we have a membership basis that joins protests, that joins strikes. There are workers within the party as well, although it's widely seen as a party that's kind of consists of more privileged people. And it's true to some extent. There are lots of people within Razem who work as teachers or academic teachers, or who are from bigger cities and from more influential kind of privileged backgrounds. But actually, a lot of them are also just paid by the state, and they often struggle with salaries. And actually, there is a lot of overlap between them and people who live in smaller cities, and that there is like a way to connect those struggles and resonate more. And also another thing that we've seen very playing a big role in this campaign was social media. So obviously something that we hear needs to happen more. So Adrian Zandberg was very active on social media, and especially with those like videos where he speaks to people on socials, where he's trying to summarize certain issues, but also even those clips from the parliament when he's actually actively attacking both Tusk and Law and Justice, and is not afraid to challenge politicians and just say that they need to start doing things in order to convince the voters and not just take them for granted. And the truth is, like, KO does take its voters for granted. That's why I think they were also surprised to lose, because they were just sort of like, of course we are the progressives who deserve to win, and we've done it in the general election, so why not now? So I think it also shows how delusional a lot of the people in KO are about just how disappointed general voting base is with their lack of effort. Here also just a quick mention also of Magda Biejat. So Magda Biejat, I've mentioned, was running also from quite progressive platform, but representing Lewica, although she formally also didn't join Lewica's party. So it's a bit, again, a weird position to have. And she was sort of, trying to do what Zandberg was doing. So she was also speaking a lot about workers' rights, and she was also not afraid to offer a real alternative, or at least, speak about like challenging the Tusk government. But also she was always doing it from a bit of a with much more caution. And she was also just trying to present as a very respectable candidate who doesn't maybe attack other candidates in such open manner. And I would say that her campaign just didn't feel very genuine, in my opinion. She just sort of seemed to try and speak to the left, but without actually saying why people choose her over Zandberg if she's already showing so much support for the current government that is disappointing. And she never really got an answer to that question, I don't think. So ultimately, when you actually look at the results, so Adrian Zandberg came fifth, He was predicted to come fourth, but unfortunately was overtaken by the very far right candidate Brown, who I can maybe mention in a second. And Magda Biejat came fifth. Sandberg came fifth, and Magda Biejat came sixth. The difference between their campaigns was also of a budget. So like Adrian Sandberg had a much smaller backing in terms of the budget. So he wasn't expected to win with Magda Biejat, but it was proven by this campaign kind of effort that it's really not about the budget, it's about how genuine your message is, and also are you able to actually go out to people, because Adrian Sandberg was also very much touring Poland a lot and just trying to speak to as many people as possible. And that is, again, another similarity between him and the far-right candidates, who are also putting a lot of effort. I think Sławomir Mencen, who came third, he was the one who actually spent the most time touring Poland. He also had quite a lot of budget for it, but he was to the point that he was missing, his sessions as an MP. He basically didn't attend any parliamentary voting sessions because he was constantly on tour. He even visited my hometown, which I can tell you is not a place that many people come. It's called Gostynin, and there's like 20,000 people living there. So me seeing Sławomir Mencen going to my hometown was just like a bit of a mindfuck, not gonna lie. And he did attract quite a lot of people because he was also just showing interest in like those smaller cities and the problems that people face there, but obviously in a very cynical way, because Sławomir Mencen never really wants to represent the interests of the working class. But he definitely tries to position himself that way, which is another similarity between him and Reform and Nigel Farage. So I'm sorry, I've been going on for quite a long time now. But to wrap this up, I wanted to also mention actual like results among different groups, because I think it's really interesting to look at how different demographics voted in this election, because that also gives us an insight into the motivations of the voters. So generally, actually, it's interesting to see that the turnout in this election was quite high. And I think second round was 71.7%. Which is very good. It's not as good as the best result that was the election 2023, but it's close to that. And what we're seeing is that women vote in greater numbers than men. 75% went to the polls compared to 70% of men, which is quite an interesting trend, and also speaks to what we've discussed, that there's lots of women who are disappointed with the current government, but they were motivated by those issues that affect them on a daily basis, such as lack of safe access to abortion. But also when you look at the differences in voting between men, young men especially, and young women, this trend that we've been seeing over the years is still there, which is basically that there's a huge opposite kind of polar gap between young men's voting and young women. So in the men's age group of 18 to 29, Sławomir Mencen, so the conservative candidate that came third, won 47.6% of the votes in the first round, ahead of Adrian Sandberg, so Razem's candidate, who came at 13.07%. Then Rafał Trzaskowski, so the Liberal candidate, was at almost 10% in this age group. And then Karol Nawrocki, so the actual winner of the election, was at 8.8. So we can see the huge disparity there, with like basically Sławomir Mencen crushing the competition in this age group. And then in the women's category, Adrian Sandberg comes first at almost 25%. So he achieved the best result, but Sławomir Mencen still came second with 21.3% of support. And they were followed by Rafał Trzaskowski, 15.5%, and Karol Nawrocki, 12.8%. percent. So what this really shows is that Sławomir Mencen did very well amongst young people in general. And that offer that he's giving, the promise of like being, you know, a bit of a rebel against the establishment, that alternative that he's supposedly supposed to give against both Law and Justice and KO is working. But also, in case of men, we know that a lot of the messaging that is resonating is around entrepreneurial messaging, him talking about lowering the taxes or even getting rid of the taxes. How is that supposed to work in practice? He never really says, but it's a very populist kind of claim that he's been using for years, and Confederacja more generally. But also, obviously, what we've seen again with reform, so scapegoating certain groups, especially attacking migrants, talking about closing the borders, making Poland white again, which, you know, is definitely still white and homogeneous, but that threat of alien cultures coming in. And also just generally being the normal alternative to all these people who are thinking about gender and LGBT plus rights, to the point that obviously like Rafał Trzaskowski, who was supposed to be an ally of the LGBT plus people, really backed out of those claims and didn't want to speak about those rights because he was just scared that he's going to be attacked by Sławomir Mencen and lose support, potential support amongst his voters in second round. So what's on the other hand very effective for the left was actually pivoting more towards talking about those bread and butter struggles, but also more strongly opposing the narrative that we've seen from the far right. So instead of leaning into it, actually saying why it's bullshit, right? So calling out this bullshit and saying, excuse me, there are no evidence that migrants affect, you know, your economy in a negative way. Also using those more class kind of terms and speaking more about how you have more similarities with a migrant than with your boss, which I think is something that people still didn't hear enough, both in the UK and Poland, and just trying to build positive politics that's based more on solidarity and just finding common struggle. And I think that is something that was very much missing from everyone else, speaking about positive politics, positive offer for your voters, what you can actually do to improve people's lives, and not just talking about what makes it worse and attacking other people. So that is
that is a lot. That is a lot of the kind of points that I was hoping we'll cover in the course of this conversation. So thank you so much, Eva. And yeah, I think there's so much going on here that is kind of the same in many ways as the politics in Bulgaria, where I'm from and where I currently am, and in a lot of European countries. And so I think it will be interesting if we can talk a little bit about the kind of the regional impact of this election and of Poland's kind of move towards the right more. Like, what does that actually mean for the sort of the Central European region, and was the EU seen as much of a factor in these elections, be it on I think you mentioned at the beginning on like climate targets and policies, or on defense, or on Ukraine, for example. Like, to what extent was there a sentiment against a common political space part of the result, or was it very much motivated by this kickback against the current government? Is I guess what I'm going to ask Anna, because I can't see Eva at the moment. I think
Yeah, no, I'm happy to answer that. Certainly the EU was, but also has been a major topic in political campaigns in Poland for years now. Poland is one of the most pro-EU countries in Europe in the sense of being very opposed to the idea of leaving the EU. I think the EU has been historically and still is seen as, joining the EU is like a continuation of the kind of democratic transformation that Poland went through like 30 years ago. More than 30 years ago now. Sorry, 5 years, God. So yeah, I think like, but at the same time, there is widespread opposition to further integration. There is widespread opposition to individual EU laws, and that's something that the right has really capitalized on. So migration and any opposition to accepting refugees has been a major talking point since at least 2015. But then more recently, campaigning against the Europe's green agenda also has become a big and quite effective mobilizing point of the right, where I didn't hear very much about the climate from the left actually in the past few years, whereas I very much did hear from the right, from the opposing side. So yeah, we're at no risk of seeing Poland leave the EU in the near future, unless we're kicked out. If Confederacja and Law and Justice were to take over and try to implement all the laws they want, we might, in the further line, you might be risking that. But in the near future, there's no risk of us leaving. However, there is a much greater risk of Poland playing a very dangerous role in the EU, aligning ourselves with the likes of Orban to push for more and more sort of regressive, racist, anti-climate policies. And unfortunately, within Europe, that's the direction in which the dial is shifting currently. So they will find a lot of allies.
Yeah, I think that's a danger that's very present and we're kind of aware of. I think now it's time to have some questions from the other participants. And I saw Seema's hand go up as well. And Seema, is this a question or is this something that I've not noticed that's been happening in the background or something?
I had a question about all these accusations about voter fraud and whether there's any mileage to that at all. It seems like it's just sore loser syndrome. And I also had another question, but I've actually forgotten it, so I'll come back to that when I remember.
Great. And we also have Joseph Healy. If you want to ask your question now, and then we can go back to Eva and Anna.
Yeah, thanks, Elena. I wanted to ask about Ukraine, both internally and externally. So someone mentioned the issue of Ukrainian refugees, of which there's a large number, I believe. I assume they didn't have any vote in this election, but how big an issue is the internal Ukrainian refugee question? And secondly, Elena has mentioned a possible tie-up with Orban and so on, but the big complication there, of course, is Poland's foreign policy towards the war in Ukraine versus Orban's. So I'm interested to know in what way will Nawrocki's election influence in any way Polish policy towards Ukraine as well?
It's a really important question. And I think Seema has remembered her second question now.
Yes, I remembered it. So I wanted to ask the other thing, because you mentioned that the Confederation candidate, or the basically the right person, had a lot of funding and was doing all these tours. And I was wondering, what can we do internationally to help in terms of funding, maybe for Razem, because I feel like there is a real need to start. I had no idea how right-wing some of these candidates were, and the fact that this meeting, I'm really glad we've pushed for it and we've held it. The fact that this has made basically no news, really, it hasn't pierced into any kind of even left consciousness, is really worrying. And I think we really need to get a move on and do something to build material solidarity, because it seems like there is mileage for Razem to actually puncture into the political space, but this resource question is what's holding us back against the far right and the millions of euros that are pouring in, especially from this new Alliance for Freedom and the other Christian Zionist organizations as well from the US who are anti-abortion. So yeah, I'm just wondering, like, if there's this material solidarity link that we can make and build, and how we can go towards that. Yep.
Great, thanks, Seema. I'm gonna go to Eva, who is hopefully back with us and heard.
Yes. Sorry, guys. I think I lost you at the exact moment when I finished speaking, right? Yeah. Okay. It was good timing. My internet just completely disconnected. I've heard the question about Ukraine, and I've heard the questions that Seema asked. So I'm going to try and quickly address those. So in terms of Ukraine, the general consensus was that, both when the war happened, initially, like all of the parties except for Confederacja, that wasn't at the time as maybe prominent in terms of as a voice. Like all of the parties were very much supporting, being like in solidarity with Ukraine. Law and Justice, who was at the time in power, opened the routes for Ukrainians to come to Poland. They also done it in such a, like, I would say, quite a good way in terms of not restricting access to like benefits, letting all the Ukrainians to like basically be able to be on same terms with Poles. Obviously, in contrast to other migrants, we know that the Belarusian border was a completely different story. But the initial response was very good, and then over the years, we sadly saw a certain shift, both with Law and Justice and the rest of the political spectrum, that was mainly pushed by the far right and forces like Confederacja. And they've been attacking migrants in general, but they've been attacking Ukrainians more specifically, saying that we've accepted so many of them, that they are taking away work, that they are opening up businesses. These are often people who are quite proactive. There's lots of like beauty salons were opened. Ukrainians are basically often able to pick up language quite quickly. They've been integrating quite well, and that obviously made Confederacja very angry, because they basically were like, we need to stop this. We can't let Ukrainians be on the same terms here as Poles. And that was something that Law and Justice surprisingly also picked up and very quickly took as their own narrative. And that, I think, was most horrifically kind of reflected in Nawrocki saying that Ukrainians shouldn't have the same access to, for instance, health services. So basically, what Nawrocki proposed is an apartheid law, where you are first screened for your nationality and ethnicity. And if you, for instance, if you're an Ukrainian or other nationality, you're supposed to go down in terms of like the line and priority. So you don't get the service that you need, and you need to, the Poles come first, which then was sort of, there was very little opposition from both KO around that. And generally, you could see that narrative shifted quite quickly. But I don't think that's exactly that. I don't think that's reflective of the Polish society, like at large. I don't think Poles want to be discriminating against Ukrainians. I think a lot of people in Poland are still very much relate to the experience of like being, in danger of Russia, and like can imagine themselves in a similar position when they need help. But that has been like the political kind of scene has been working to like erode that empathy and ability to connect on a more kind of also emotional level. So I don't know what Anna would add on that, but that's my answer. That's what I'm seeing. I think, yeah, a lot of people are still reluctant, but we definitely, Confederacja voters are much more on board, and we're seeing the change among Law and Justice as well. But then also with the other question about material solidarity with Razem, I'm very thankful for that question. I think one thing I didn't mention is that Razem really did break into the mainstream with this presidential campaign. And we regained our kind of almost brand identity, if you want to use the like marketing term, because Razem was kind of in the shadow of Lewica for the past few years. And in this election, we've seen a huge influx of like interest, and the campaign was really strong. So that really helped to put us back on the map of like parties that you can vote for. And that is reflected in like members, because lots of people want to now join Razem. We've seen this enormous increase in like applications to join Razem, even within the international branch, which I'm the part of. We've had over 150 applications. So that means like all the places outside of Poland. So that is it's basically not like tripling the amount of members that we had so far. And then in Poland, also basically doubling the amount of people who want to join the party. So like, over 5,000, I think, applications, which also is a challenge for us. It's a challenge in terms of like implementing those people, making sure that we're screening them, that they are like, aligned with our party's program, or if they're not fully, then kind of identifying that, being able to also do internal education. With that popularity, we also got more people kind of just paying donations through our website. We've been pushing that all on social media. That was part of our messaging throughout the campaign, and we did see that we were able to collect quite a lot of money. But obviously the problem with Razem is we are backed by just small donations from the voters or people who are interested in our politics, but we don't get big money from millionaires or entrepreneurs, because obviously that's not in the interest of those people. So we are in need of having like financial support, and it would be great if we could, reach out to the left outside of Poland and have that support. And I think there are some plans to do it, because now, as I've said, because the international branch is also growing, we are really hoping, that's a little bit of a sneak peek from what we're planning, but we want to organize a meeting that is more open, like it's in English, maybe possibly in London quite soon, and speak about the effort to like also of Razem to engage with international left. Is something we didn't have the time to talk about, but there's European Left Alliance that very recently in mid-June had a first conference in Porto, and our representative Zofia Malisz was there, and also Adrian Zandberg and Aleksandra Owca, so the co-leaders of the party were speaking there, and basically trying to build connections with France, with Germany, with Spain, with all sorts of parts of the international left, and we don't have enough of those connections with the UK, I don't think. So that's the answer from me. I don't know if Anna wants to add something.
Yeah, I know we're running out of time, but just a few things briefly. So on the practical level, I don't believe Razem as such is allowed to take donations from abroad. Like political parties can get funding from abroad. Funding to the far right is often funneled through NGOs, think tanks, organizations like that. And the Polish left is really lacking funding and lacking institutions to even be able to accept that funding. So I think that's a big conversation to be had internally of, if we are building this broad network of solidarity, how do we do that legally? On the point of Ukraine, Ukrainians obviously did not have a vote in this election, even though their lives are being very directly impacted. In general, there is a growing war fatigue in Poland. I don't think we'll see a kind of big U-turn in terms of suddenly backing Russia or being opposed to arming Ukraine. Poland very much see it as its own defense interest to support Ukraine in this war. But there is a war fatigue, and especially now that we have a president. Well, the previous president was also close to Trump, and this one's probably even closer. There is a risk of our sort of the leadership we've taken within the EU on supporting Ukraine slightly softening, although, as I said, it will not be a dramatic U-turn. On the question of voter fraud, there have been recounts in various polling stations where it was identified that votes were not counted correctly. I don't believe there was some kind of like big conspiracy. I think there might have been like local irregularities, but mainly it is Trzaskowski. I think it's basically the fact that Trzaskowski took his victory for granted, imagined himself as president for years. When one exit poll showed him narrowly ahead, he immediately gave a victory speech. I think he can personally just like not accept that he actually lost the election. That's what's going on here. And I don't think it helps KO. I don't think it helps progressives at all to be like fighting this fight instead of fighting the political fight, which is the more important one that we have to win.
Thanks, Anna. I think that clarifies the situation quite a lot, and also I think it illustrates that we all have a lot of work ahead of us to do, and maybe to build on some of these very positive interventions that Razem have been doing. But also when we talk about offering kind of material support and solidarity, I think we should offer that to each other, and maybe some of those meetings that Eva was mentioning in terms of like Razem visiting places and talking about their experience. I mean, there's a lot that the British left needs to be learning from people building power elsewhere. So maybe it can start as something a bit more kind of, I don't know, amorphous in terms of what kind of support we offer to each other, but it's there for the taking. You know, I'm a bit saddened to hear that there isn't so far such a strong link with a movement in the UK as in other places in Europe. Well, we should
Yes, for sure. And I actually just put the link to a charity that is sort of associated with Razem. I mean, not, again, there are like legal caveats, but this is, they have a like section of the website that's in English, and they, for instance, sponsor like educational camps for like young people. This charity also been involved in like helping with the podcast that Razem was indirectly kind of contributing to, like was not run directly by Razem, but lots of other Razem members were involved in, called Odsłuch Społeczny, the social listening, that I also kind of worked for a few years back. So if you really want to like, support, the easiest way to do that would be through this link. And also just to plug in, because we've mentioned that, there were very few media that covered this topic. Actually, one media that did cover the topic of Polish election is Nawara. Both Anna and I, we've co-written an article. So I'm just going to link it here in case you want to just look at some, numbers. Nothing really that we didn't mention here. In fact, this call was much more extensive than the article itself. But maybe one point of reference just to plug it in here. Yeah.
And also, I'm gonna also encourage the people who are with us still, and also people who will be watching maybe the recording of this, because we've recorded it, to also give your podcast a listen, because there's a lot more context and a lot of like really interesting kind of big and small aspects of Polish political life that are part of the Polkast. I'm going to call it a day for this conversation, but I think, as I started with my introduction, we see this very much as a continued collaboration, conversation, and a growing interest we have. There is no point to another Europe is possible if we don't actually support movements, organizations, parties, people with the same aims as us across Europe and across the world. And so we're very committed to keep doing that work, and to keep coming together to reflect on where we've done well and where we've had a setback, and how we can learn from that. It's been really useful for me, for sure, to hear from Anna and Eva. It's given me some ideas about my own kind of political context here in Bulgaria at the moment, and hopefully it's made the Polish elections, but also the kind of general situation in Poland and the region a bit clearer for people, and it's given you a renewed motivation to be involved in our campaigns. So thank you for joining us. The recording will be sent through. It will be on YouTube. Do share it with friends, colleagues, comrades that might be interested. And we will see each other very soon, I'm sure.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you
Bye.
all. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.